How's everyone doing? So who's used Vue.js? Hands up. Who doesn't like Vue.js? Get out. Who likes it? Good. Right, so essentially Vue.js has become massive over the last probably year or so. Started with Evan Yu creating it in his spare time, and then it's gone from this small-fledged framework to this big library system with loads of tools such as Vue CLI, dev tools. So the ecosystem is going massively with it. So what I want to try and do is cater for some younger Vue devs and talk about content distribution. And then probably for those more experienced, we're going to some new API from 2.1. So you can follow along the slides or look at the slides with that link at the top. Plus this is being recorded and I'll post a link on Twitter. You can follow me at Blake Newman. Use hashtag VueLondon. So I work on the core team, well, not work, partake with the core team of Vue.js. So I know the ins and outs to some degree of the framework, but as it's evolved, I'm losing track and I've got to catch myself back up. But there's some great contributors there, and if you want to get involved, the best thing you can do is essentially help with Stack Overflow questions, help with GitHub issues, and then eventually, if you start contributing, you'll be able to be part of that big ecosystem and probably part of the core team as well. And we're always looking for people that are valuable to the team. So aside of that, I work for Sainsbury's. So we use Vue in a lot of our internal tools. We also use it, some elements we want to start using within public-facing tools if we can. But we're still kind of in that testing phase because React is still very big and we can't just overshadow that opinion that we have a lot of React developers over Vue developers. But you can see the disparity lowering and more Vue developers coming around. So if anyone has any questions or wants to look into joining Sainsbury's or anything, come talk to me or any of our other developers. We'll be happy to give you more insight. And if you really want to get involved with Vue itself, you can talk to me or talk to the team that runs it. So I think, what's happened? It broke. That's not good. There you go. My slides are, there we go. There we go. So what is content distribution? All right. Step one. You'll never know. There you go, it works here. So, content distribution is interweaving the parent content into your child content. So essentially templates, for example, getting that template and distributing it to your child components. You don't have to create tons of components to do the single thing you want it to do. So, for example, we have a default list component, and we'll go into how we're going to create something like this in a second. And we have a custom list component. So essentially all we're doing is a user has a Vue logo to it. But you can do this in multiple ways, and typically in Vue 1.0 and React you'd create another list component, which you don't want to have to do really at all because that requires you putting more effort, more components, but there's ways you can get around that using the slot API. So essentially this is what the list component will look like if you created a simple list component. So you have your URLs, and then for each LI, you'd loop over it for each item in the data, and then you'd print out what the item is. And then you could have some styles if you're using Vue components, and then you have your script. So this is the wrong direction. So the implementation of this would be you'd use the list component as such in a template, and then you'd pass some data, say an array of items, and then what you'd do then is it would render and looks like that. So it's just a standard list. That's your output. So then we want to add the image in. So if you go and put that into your traditional component, as you probably do with 1.0 without the slot API, you just have a if statement in there saying if the item is equal to a user, display the image that we want, which means that as you can see, that's already flawed, because that means as your component grows in complexity, you're going to add more if statements, and that just feels ugly and wrong. So implementation looks similarly the same, so you just render a list component, and then you get the output. But yeah, it's not the best implementation you can do. There's loads of things you can do to make it better. So we can look at the slot API. So the slot API is essentially web spec web components, but we've brought that spec in to Vue.js to allow you to do all of this amazing stuff from web specs now. So essentially what you'd have is an app layout component. I don't know how well you can see it. And then you'd have the outer container. Then you'd have slots in there. So there we go. So you'd have the header, main, footer, for example, and you put in a slot called header, a slot called footer, and you can have a default slot as well. And then the way you'd use it in the parent, it should say h1 slot equals header, and then you paste in the content, and that would distribute that to there, those two paragraphs to there, and the footer to there, giving us the output of something like this: header with h1, main, pp, main, footer, blah, blah, blah. So that gives us a lot of flexibility. That means we can take the abstraction away from that component and put it into the parent component, which means you have tons more flexibility. But there's some slight problems with that. The list component with a slot would look like this. You'd have your default slot, and then you'd loop over that li list as you usually do. Then the implementation comes out into the parent, which means all of your implementation detail becomes to smart components. And I dictate smart components as your top level components, such as routers. And then you'd have your dumb components, which should literally be as dumb as you can make them, which just get fed in props and slots. So you'd do that, and you'd say, if the item is user, we want to display an image. It doesn't work like that, because we don't have context of the data. We don't know what that data item is. We just know we're rendering this part in the list, so it's always going to do that. So again, meh. So what we have now in 2.1 is scope slots. So scope slots essentially bringing context to a passed-in slot from your parent. So that gives you super amounts of benefits. So if you think of it this way, if you have a modal component and you're passing data to it, and you want that data to be on your parent component so you can actually contextualize what you're passing to it, you can do loads of different things. And it's really helpful for lists, for example, where you're inside of a for loop, when you're rendering a table or something, because you can just create custom templates really easily. So the component would essentially be slot, name item, fee for item in data, and then you pass in the text property to the slot. So that means that that text item will be then passed to the slot component when you pass it in through the parent. And then you pass in the data, for example. And then the implementation looks similar to our normal slot API, except now we wrap it inside of a template and then declare our scope. And then we can then declare if it's a child text equals a user, then we'll render out this custom template. If not, it will just default back to our default fallback content. So essentially, what that means is we're able to render a list by the context of the parent rather than the context of the child, which saves you having to write 10 components for each type of list you're going to render. You're keeping your components dumb and making the parent components smart. So, yay. So, also, we have VueConf 2017, the first official Vue conference. If you go to conference.vue.js.org, you'll be able to keep in touch with details, buy tickets when they come onto sale. And it's in Wrocław, Poland 2017, most likely June time. But keep in details with it and you'll be able to come hopefully join us. So that's my talk. Any questions and answers? Questions? No? Good. Nice and easy. Oh no, we have one. Oh.
So isn't that just increasing the level of complexity through abstraction?
No, because what you're essentially doing is taking the abstraction to one place, which would be a list where you're going v else, v, which normally in normal JavaScript you would frown upon, and taking it up one level so you don't have to have that context of a loop with multiple if statements in. You're bringing out that, which means you can do very powerful stuff in the context of a child component in an abstraction of the parent, which makes it simpler. And you can write, and most of the time you won't go and make that custom template, but there's scenarios where you would need a custom template, and instead of adding a prop or something to your component, you would just pass in a scoped slot and then it would render how you like.
So you're defining the template in two separate places?
So,
one in the parent,
yes.
defining it again in the child.
So what you're doing is you're creating a list component. So imagine just a list component and it's just rendering a list, a URL, li. And then by default you say it will render as a normal list would do, which would be, for example, that. You're just rendering a normal list, user, not to user, from your data object. And then what essentially you're doing is you're passing in a custom template on criteria. So you do have some template coming out of it, but what you'd normally find is that if you was to write that in a single component, such as a list component, and you're saying if on these 10 different criteria I want to render something different, you're going to have a lot of problem. That component's going to become huge and you'll just get lost within what it actually does. Whereas you can take passing in that custom template to when you need to do that. So you do write HTML markup outside of the child, but in normal sense it's being rendered inside the child context. Right, good.
The example is very basic, that in other cases where you have more complex components it will make more sense. I mean,
Yes.
for that one, I'll give it like that, everything in just one template. But if I have a very complex component with 10 different cases,
Yeah.
then that will handy.
So essentially what I find it falls down to is if you're using this for a table or something, so you've got a table and then for this column you want to render it to look like this. Example, this column from a table. And instead of having to write that condition in a complex component already where you've got those nested for ifs, you've got that one template that you pass to. I can actually show you some code quickly if we've got time of how it works. So let's have a look. There you go. So we have a table like this where we have data being passed to it, and then you've got a table header which maps all of that data to the correct columns. And then I have a custom template here, which is a custom slot for all of the D columns. So rather than me having to write that statement inside that table component, I'm doing it on that layer outside when I can do what I like on that parent. So the parent takes control and this becomes a smart component. So it's essentially a smart component passing to a dumb component. And then if you look at the actual table component, you understand why I've abstracted it, you abstract it away. Is you open up the table, it's just a huge render function. So if I'd had to put, frozen, but essentially if I had to put that logic within that already complex component, because it's rendering out a complex table, I'd have to write an if statement here, an if statement there, and it becomes illegible. So you take that illegibility away and your components become simpler. Has it started working yet? There we go. So it's essentially just a massive render function.
So you're talking about very complex if statements.
Yep.
Why don't you just build computed properties and put all of your if statements into those instead?
So I didn't quite catch that.
So you're saying that you want to avoid very complex if statements in your list.
Yep.
Why don't you just calculate some computed properties on the component and house all of your if statements in there instead?
You can do it that way, but you'll find over time that the component will get slower to render, because each time you render that component, you're having to go through that if statement tree. And each time you may update a value, that computed property will be re-evaluated. Whereas if you did it on the parent component and you're looking at the parent data and rendering based on what you look like, you're only doing that once. So if your child component gets updated with, say, a prop or something, it's not going to have to go through that whole cycle of checking whether it's doing that. And plus, if statements in a computed property, you're taking abstraction to another place anyway. It may be in the child component, but it still adds complexity somewhere within the whole hierarchy of your application. Oh, another question.
So how do you stop your parent component just becoming this bloated piece of mess?
So that page that I showed you is a mess because it's just a load of components just compiled together.
Yeah.
So what you can do is use a Vue router, for example, and if you're using that, you can have child component templates inside of it. So you'd have a child root, for example. So you'd have a main root that renders that part, and then you're only caring about that content contained within that root area. So then you're still breaking down your pages, but essentially having one page with a lot of statements in it is not as bad as having a component with 100 statements in it trying to do the same thing as what your parent's doing. Your parent has all of the control about passing down those props that eventually it will cancel out and you won't have that horrible mess because you're taking that mess away from the children and putting it into the parent, and the parent normally doesn't get that complex.
So it seems to me what you're saying, just let me check this, is you can have a generic data grids table component.
Yeah.
And there's always a special case. There's always an edge case.
Yeah.
There's always, I want this column to be slightly different. And the name slots are saying, I'm going to take this edge case and put it in the place where I need to use it and not put it in
Yes.
the generic component.
Yep.
Because if I put it in the generic component, there's going to be 100 edge cases.
It's not generic anymore.
And all the complexity's going to be there. So
Yep.
that's the point of it. Is that
Yeah, so essentially you're making a component stay generic and you're taking the components that aren't generic and keeping them non-generic.
You're putting that edge case in
Yep.
a place where it actually occurs
So yeah,
instead of in a massively overcomplicated.
Yeah.
Generic
same with the way you would do it with React, because React you just normally create another component to render it in a slightly different form, but with the slot API you don't need to do that. It comes down to smart components versus dumb components, and that's one thing you find mentioned quite a lot within the world of applications, is that you'd have those smart pages and you'd keep those as those contain the complexity because that's what your page is formed of. And then all of your elements, such as a input button, those are very dumb. You pass props to it, and it will render how you like. And then that edge case is in one layer.
To keep the override in the place where you're actually
Yep.
needing that override.
Yep.
Okay, cool. I think we need
Yep.
to move on.
Yep.
Thank you very, very much, Blake.